Welcome back. Now in the last lesson we learned that if you want to make a lasting change with anything, then the only way to do so is by experiencing a change in your identity. And the way to do that is to essentially become confident in being able to do the new patterns of behaviour, and especially the new patterns of thinking, that will not only enable you to do the things that you want to do, but most importantly, become the person that you want to become. The big hurdle that gets in most people's way, however, is that most people have a fundamental flaw in their understanding about how to actually go about building confidence. And so in this lesson, I'm going to share with you what that hurdle is, and most importantly, I'm going to show you how to get around it, so that way you can learn how to build confidence in anything you want to achieve. To make it a lot easier for you to understand, let me share with you a really famous set of psychological studies referred to as the candle problem. Now, if you haven't already heard of it, if you were a volunteer in one of the candle problem studies, what would happen is you'd be led into a room where you see a table up against a wall, and on that table you'll see a candle, you'll see a packet of matches, and a box of thumbtacks. Now, the researchers would tell you that your task is to figure out a way to be able to light the candle and let it burn all the way down, but to make sure that not one single bit of wax drips onto the table. So when given these instructions, people start getting kind of creative with different ideas about how to attach the candle to the wall. So some people, for example, might try and melt the wax so the candle sticks to the wall that way, but that doesn't really work. Some people will try using the thumbtacks to try and stick the candle on the wall using thumbtacks, but that doesn't really work either. Usually most people will figure out in around about 10 to 15 minutes that all you have to do is empty out the box of tacks and then attach the box to the wall and use that to catch the wax. It's that simple. But most people take around about 10 or 15 minutes to figure that out. Now, the original purpose of this study was to look at what we call functional fixedness. So in other words, when we look at the box of tacks, our brain sees the box as having a single use, in that case, to hold the tacks. However, once we start to use some of the more creative processes that our brain is capable of, that's when we can start to think outside the box and realize that that same box could also have a dual purpose. In this case, it can be used to catch the wax. But here's the really fascinating part in the story of the candle problem's history. So a few years later, some different researchers this time replicated the same study, only this time they did something slightly different. If you're a participant in group 1, you would have been led into the room, shown the problem, given the instruction, only this time you'd also be told that you're being timed. You'd be told that, look, we're just going to time you because we're taking an average of how long it takes people to figure out the problem. Okay, but if you're a participant in group 2, however, you'd be told something slightly different. What you'd be told is, okay, we're going to time you and we're going to compare your times to all the other participants' times. And if you achieve a score in the top 20%, we're going to give you a financial reward. In fact, if you achieve the very best time, if you come first in this competition, you're going to receive an even larger financial reward. So basically, if you're in group 2, you're now incentivized. You have a motive to try harder, to work faster, to achieve a faster outcome. So it would make sense that if you're in group 2, you'd probably be able to achieve that outcome a bit faster, wouldn't you? But surprisingly, the results found that the incentivized group actually performed more poorly, being more than 20% slower compared to the non-incentivized group, who on average actually achieved better outcomes. Just take a moment to think about that. That's almost the exact opposite of the way that we traditionally think about motivating people. Usually when parents want to motivate children, teachers want to motivate students, employers want to motivate employees, the usual approach is to offer them some kind of reward, some kind of incentive that will supposedly make them work harder and perform better and make them feel more motivated. And yet, this study has found that that's not actually the case at all. But here's the really fascinating bit, and this is where it gets really interesting. What they did then was they repeated the same study, only this time, rather than see the box of tacks, the way that they would show the participants they would show them the box and then the tacks sitting outside the box. So in other words, the barrier of functional fixedness was no longer there. This time, the incentivized group actually did perform a lot better. On average, the people that were given the incentive to make more money actually performed the task significantly faster compared to the group who weren't given the incentive. So, what was the difference? Before I explain what the difference is, let's back up a little bit and look at what does it do to our mind when somebody says, now you have a potential to succeed at something. See, the moment that the people in the second group were told that essentially if they came in a certain position that they would be given a reward, it now becomes a competitive environment. It's a competition. They have the potential to win, but it also means that by definition, they also have the potential to lose. You see, if you're in a situation where you have the ability to succeed, you also therefore, by default, have the potential to fail. So the incentive is not just to win or to succeed, but the incentive is also now to avoid failure or feeling like a loser. And so what happens on the inside is essentially that inner parental voice starts to increase the musts. The rules start to increase. Suddenly there's a rule that says, well, you not only must succeed in order to feel good enough, but you must avoid failure in order to avoid feeling like a loser. So here's a much easier way to think of this, okay? Imagine here's a line, here's a scale, here's like a tube or a hose, okay? And over this side of the scale represents the things that you feel that you can do, the things that you feel confident with, okay? The things that are on your inner child's list of cans. And the further you get towards the other side, the further away you feel from those list of things you feel confident towards. So in other words, the things over here are the things that you don't feel confident with at all. Now, the moment that the parental voice increased the musts, what happens is it essentially creates pressure. Now, pressure is not necessarily a bad thing, but it depends where on that scale that particular task fits for you. So, basically, here's what happened. The moment it becomes competitive, it increases the pressure. The people in the first study looked at the box, the functional fixedness got in the way. So in other words, when their mind sees that, the initial reaction is, that seems kind of complicated, it seems a bit hard. So in other words, they don't feel particularly confident in their ability to do that. So when the pressure is increased in that moment, what happens is it essentially acts as like a ball and chain around the person's ankle. When we feel under pressure to do something we don't feel confident with, that's what causes that sort of internal magnetic resistance. That's what causes that repulsion. It makes it more difficult to achieve or difficult to keep going with it, and eventually becomes more exhausting and we give up. However, when that task is further over towards our sense of cans, the exact reverse is true. So in the second study, when people looked at the tasks outside the box, they go, yeah, well, I could probably use the box in some way. I could probably figure this out. So in other words, it just seemed easier, and as a result, the people felt more confident in their ability to achieve it. So when the pressure is increased by means of competition, the pressure actually motivates them to achieve a faster and more successful result. So the moment that you have an incentive to succeed, but also the potential to fail, that's going to work wonderfully so long as you already feel confident towards that thing. And so that actually explains a lot about the way that people are. What we tend to do is we tend to gravitate towards the things that we already feel confident with. We tend to go out and build on our existing strengths whilst avoiding the things that we feel are our weaknesses. And yet, what do we typically do when we try to motivate ourselves to do something? We just increase the musts. We put pressure on ourselves. And yes, pressure will work to a certain extent, but it's like dragging along with that ball and chain around our ankles. It gets us to a certain point, but then we become exhausted and we give up. That's the way that most parents try to motivate their children. It's the way that most teachers try to motivate their students. It's the way that most employees try to motivate their employees. They create incentives and rewards. They say, look, if you achieve this, if you become good at this, look at what reward you'll get. And so some of them achieve that and they go, yes, that worked with them. But the others, they just assume, we're not capable or not competent or just not good enough. So here's the lesson that I'd like you to take on board here, is that if you want to make a change to your identity, there's a very good chance that you're going to be targeting a particular area that you don't feel confident with. You're going to be targeting your weaknesses, the areas that you feel vulnerable. And so in order to do that, the only way you can increase the cans is to decrease the must. You have to take the pressure off yourself. Otherwise, it's just going to send you around and around in circles. You'll continue to build on your strengths and increase the things that you already feel confident with, but meanwhile, you'll leave your weaknesses behind and you'll just go around in circles. So you remember back in that first session where I made such a big fuss about trusting yourself and giving yourself permission to take the pressure off yourself? Well, perhaps now that's starting to make a lot more sense. While this may make sense in theory, here's the problem that you're going to encounter when it comes to actually putting this into practice. And that is that the world out there is very competitive. The world out there is absolutely chock full of those voice of musts. And the way that our superego or inner parent works is, unless we communicate differently with it, it simply soaks up and absorbs the voice of society around us. And the voice of society is generally going to be one that will increase the pressure rather than take it off. Which means that your ability to learn how to create that personal boundary that separates the voice of the outside world with your own internal dialogue becomes much more important than ever if you want to make the change that you've come here looking for. Now that inner parental voice of rules and musts, etc., is really just like a robot. It's just been programmed by the outside world, especially during your upbringing. But your conscious adult self has the ability to kind of step in front of it and instead change the way that it communicates with the inner child part of you. And that's where you have the ability to decrease the must so that you can give your inner child the opportunity to increase the cans and move those lists of tasks that you want to change away from this side of the scale and over towards the can, so that then when you go back into the outside world, then all the pressure out there, it won't have that detrimental effect anymore. If anything, it will actually motivate you to become even stronger. So to make it crystal clear, the goal here essentially, if you want to change your identity, the goal is to essentially reprogram your inner parental voice so as to reparent your inner child. So here's the question that I'd like you to ponder for a moment. Once you start to sort of step in front of that robotic inner parental voice of rules and must, once you can sort of take over and consciously intervene in the way that you're communicating with that inner child voice, what specifically do you say that's different? And it's really a 4-step process. And in the next 4 lessons, I'm going to give you each of those 4 steps. The big mistake that most people make in that process of trying to change their identity is that they inadvertently focus their attention on the wrong things. They focus on the things that actually keep them stuck rather than focus their attention on the things that will help facilitate that change. And so in the next lesson, I'm going to show you very specifically what that thing is to focus on. And just to give you a clue, it relates very much to the way that you praise yourself. Because the way that praise is usually used, although with good intentions, is actually usually used in a way that actually keeps people stuck going around in circles.
Whenever you have the potential to succeed, it becomes a competitive environment, which also gives us the potential to fail. This increases the parental voice of musts, which in turn creates pressure. Pressure will improve our performance and progress if we already feel confident, but if we don't, it slows us down, wears us out, and eventually we give up. So, whilst the goal is to create confidence, when it comes to tackling our weaknesses, we first need to take the pressure off by decreasing the musts and creating a permissive headspace. The competitive world outside is loaded with pressure, however, which programs your inner parent This makes it more important to know how to utilize that personal boundary that separates the pressure of the outside world. If you can do this long enough to create a permissive headspace on the inside, you can reprogram your inner parent to reparent your inner child to build your confidence and grow your identity. Then, once you feel confident, the pressure of the competitive world will only motivate you and make you stronger. How you do this, however, will depend on exactly what you focus on, and in the next lesson, Stuart will show you exactly what that is.